Chapter 1. Introduction to Wealth and Legacy. 15 March 1881, Tuesday, Milan, Italy. Luisa Aman enters the world as heir to one of Italy's greatest industrial fortunes, inheriting 15 million lire after her parents' deaths, equivalent to billions today. Raised in the marble halls of Palazzo Aman, she grows up surrounded by unimaginable luxury, yet feels profoundly empty. Her arranged marriage to Marchese Camillo Casati Stampa di Sonsino promises to secure her position among Italy's aristocratic elite, but conventional life suffocates her artistic soul. As she stands in her wedding ballroom surrounded by Europe's nobility, Luisa experiences a dangerous epiphany. Money could purchase more than comfort. It could buy immortality itself. The chapter establishes the gilded cage of her inheritance, the suffocating expectations of her class, and the first stirrings of rebellion against a life of predetermined roles. Through vivid descriptions of palatial wealth, contrasted with emotional barrenness, we see the seeds of her future transformation. The tone is opulent yet foreboding, hinting at the tragedy that will unfold when unlimited resources meet an insatiable hunger for meaning. The central question emerges: what is the true cost of becoming unforgettable when your only currency is inherited billions and an aching, unsatisfied soul? The Aman Palazzo stood like a monument to industrial triumph on Via Monte Napoleone, its facade gleaming with the kind of wealth that transforms stone into poetry. Inside, in a nursery where hand-painted frescoes depicted classical mythology, Luisa Aman entered a world already purchased for her. Her father, Alberto Aman, had built an empire on cotton mills stretching across northern Italy. Her mother, Lucia, brought Viennese aristocratic bloodlines. Together, they represented the perfect marriage of new money and ancient nobility, and their daughter would inherit both legacies. But inheritance, as Luisa would discover, meant more than receiving. It meant carrying the weight of expectation, the burden of continuation, the silent demand that one's life justify the fortunes of the dead. The nursery where infant Luisa slept was worth more than most families would earn in 10 lifetimes. Venetian glass chandeliers scattered winter light into rainbow fragments across walls, covered in silk damask. Her cradle, commissioned from Florence's finest craftsmen, was carved from rare mahogany and inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Even in sleep, she was surrounded by beauty that demanded to be noticed, appreciated, remembered. By age 13, both parents had died, leaving Luisa and her sister Francesca as two of Europe's wealthiest orphans. 15 million lire passed into Luisa's control, a sum whose purchasing power defied comprehension. At an age when most girls played with dolls, Luisa Aman could have bought entire neighborhoods, commissioned private railways, or funded expeditions to unexplored continents. Yet money could not fill the palazzo's empty corridors with her mother's laughter. It could not resurrect her father's reassuring presence in his study, where he had once explained compound interest while she sat on his knee, half understanding, half dreaming. The inheritance that made her powerful also made her alone. Her guardians, distant relatives managing her fortune with meticulous care, ensured she received appropriate education. She studied French, German, and English. She learned piano with technical precision. She was taught conversation's subtle arts, the proper depth of a curtsy, the exact angle for holding a fan. Everything prepared her for her ultimate destiny, a brilliant marriage uniting her fortune with an appropriate family name. On 13 June 1900, that destiny arrived in Camillo Casati Stampa di Sonsino, whose title stretched through centuries of Lombard nobility. He was handsome in the conventional way of aristocratic men, tall, well-groomed, utterly unremarkable. His family owned vast estates, but their ancient name carried debts only fresh capital could resolve. The marriage was perfect in every practical sense, satisfying everyone except the bride. Luisa was 19 on her wedding day, standing before a mirror in a gown costing more than a worker's annual salary. The dress was a masterpiece of Belgian lace and seed pearls, designed by Paris's most fashionable atelier. She looked exactly as a wealthy bride should, beautiful, composed, valuable. But studying her reflection, she felt the first stirrings of rebellion that would eventually consume her entire fortune. The wedding ceremony took place in Milan's Duomo, where light filtered through stained glass to paint the faithful in borrowed heavenly colors. 300 guests filled the pews, industrialists, nobles, politicians, artists, all witnessing the joining of Aman money with Casati lineage. The priest's Latin blessings echoed off marble columns, while Luisa made promises she already knew she might not keep. The reception sprawled through the Casati Palazzo, a Renaissance masterpiece that would now become her cage. Champagne flowed from fountains. Orchestras played in 3 ballrooms. The wedding cake stood taller than most men, its tiers decorated with spun sugar roses and gold leaf. Everything was excessive, expensive, expected. But as midnight approached and Luisa stood on a balcony overlooking the palazzo's gardens, watching her guests dance below, she felt clarity, almost painful in its intensity. This life, this carefully constructed existence of appropriate marriages and inherited responsibilities, was a kind of death, a slow suffocation by silk and diamonds. She thought of the artists she had glimpsed at the reception, poets and painters invited to add cultural legitimacy to the evening's display of wealth. They moved with different energy, as if they inhabited their bodies more fully, as if they had discovered some secret about existence that money alone could never purchase. They would be remembered, she realized. Their names would echo through history, while hers would be reduced to a footnote, another wealthy woman who married well and disappeared into domestic obscurity. Unless. The word hung in her mind like a challenge, like a promise, like a threat. Unless she could transform herself into something transcending mere wealth, unless she could use her billions not to secure comfort but to purchase immortality, unless she could become a work of art herself, so shocking, so spectacular, so utterly unforgettable that history would have no choice but to remember her name. Her husband found her on the balcony, concern creasing his conventional features. "Are you well, my dear? The guests are asking for you." Luisa turned to face him, and in that moment she made a decision that would ultimately destroy her fortune, scandalize 2 continents, and transform her into exactly what she desired, a legend that money could buy, but sanity could not sustain. "I'm perfectly well," she said, taking his arm. "I was just thinking about the future." Chapter 2. The Rise and the Initial Struggles. 22 March 1905, Wednesday, Venice, Italy. In the early years of marriage, Luisa discovers conventional aristocratic life offers only tedium and social performance. Motherhood, she gives birth to daughter Christina in 1901, fails to provide the meaning she craves. Everything changes when she encounters Europe's avant-garde artists and intellectuals, particularly the infamous poet Gabriele D'Annunzio, who becomes her gateway to a world where beauty and scandal intertwine. Luisa begins her dramatic transformation, spending extravagantly on exotic fashion, dramatic public appearances, and a menagerie of exotic animals. She establishes herself in Venice's Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, transforming it into a temple of aesthetic excess. Her husband watches with growing alarm as his wife reinvents herself, spending vast sums on costumes, parties, and artistic patronage. The conventional marriage crumbles under the weight of her escalating eccentricities and public affairs. The chapter explores the emotional cost of her metamorphosis, the growing distance from her daughter, the dissolution of normal relationships, the intoxicating but isolating nature of her chosen path. It ends with her definitive choice to abandon conventional life entirely, leaving behind the safety of marriage and motherhood to pursue her vision of becoming a living work of art, regardless of the cost to her reputation or relationships. The villa overlooked Lake Como's waters so blue they seemed stolen from dreams, but Luisa spent most mornings staring at walls. Marriage, she had discovered, was an elaborate exercise in disappearance. She was expected to host dinner parties where men discussed politics while women compared servants' quality. She was supposed to find fulfillment selecting wallpaper, organizing charity events, producing an heir to continue the Casati line. She had performed that final duty with mechanical efficiency. Christina was born in November 1901, a healthy daughter immediately handed to successive nurses and governesses. Luisa looked at the infant and felt distant affection, the kind one might feel for a beautiful object belonging to someone else. Motherhood, she realized with something close to horror, was simply another role she was expected to perform, another script written by people who had died centuries ago. Her husband seemed content with their arrangement. Camillo had married her for her fortune, and she had fulfilled that expectation by existing and producing an heir. He maintained mistresses in Milan with aristocratic men's casual entitlement, never bothering to hide his infidelities because discretion would have implied guilt. Luisa was supposed to ignore these arrangements, focusing on managing households and appearing at appropriate social functions with appropriate expressions of contentment. Instead, she began to read. The villa's library became her sanctuary, filled with books Camillo's ancestors had collected, but never opened. She devoured philosophy, poetry, history, anything offering an alternative to the suffocating present. She read Nietzsche and understood that morality was a construct, that individuals could create their own values. She discovered decadent poets who celebrated beauty and excess as forms of rebellion against bourgeois mediocrity. She learned that art could be a religion, that aesthetics could provide meaning conventional faith no longer offered. But reading was not enough. Books described worlds Luisa wanted to inhabit, experiences she longed to claim as her own. The transformation began in Venice during Carnival season 1904. Luisa attended a masked ball at Palazzo Barbaro, where expatriate artists and writers mingled with Italian nobility. She wore a costume of her own design, a gown of peacock feathers that caught candlelight and transformed her into something between woman and bird. Her mask was decorated with real emeralds, but it was her presence that captivated attention. She moved through rooms as if she owned not just the space, but the very air, commanding notice through sheer force of will. It was there she met Gabriele D'Annunzio. The poet was already infamous throughout Italy, known equally for lyrical genius and scandalous affairs. He was short, balding, utterly unremarkable in appearance, yet possessed charisma that transcended physical beauty. When he spoke, language became seduction. When he looked at a woman, she felt herself transformed into poetry. "You are trying too hard," he told Luisa, his first words a calculated insult designed to provoke. She should have been offended. Instead, she laughed. "And you are too short to criticize anyone's efforts." He smiled, recognizing a worthy opponent. "Then we are both striving to overcome our natural limitations. How refreshing to find someone who understands that life is performance." They talked until dawn, standing on a balcony overlooking the Grand Canal while the party continued without them. D'Annunzio spoke of art as the only authentic religion, of beauty as a moral imperative, of the necessity of living one's life as if it were a work of art. He described his vision of the Superman, not Nietzsche's philosophical abstraction, but a real individual who transcended conventional morality through sheer aesthetic audacity. "You have money," he said finally, studying her with eyes that missed nothing. "But money without imagination is merely accounting. What will you do with your billions? Buy more villas? Commission more portraits? Die wealthy and forgotten?" The question struck her like a physical blow, because it articulated the fear she had been unable to name. She was 23 years old, possessed of a fortune that could reshape reality, yet she was spending her days selecting table linens and pretending to care about her husband's opinions on railway investments. "What should I do?" she asked, hearing the desperation in her own voice. D'Annunzio leaned closer, his breath smelling of wine and tobacco. Become a legend. Use your money to transform yourself into something so spectacular that history will have no choice but to remember you. Scandal, beauty, excess, these are the tools of immortality. Be shocking, be magnificent, be unforgettable. It was permission she hadn't known she needed. Permission to abandon the role of dutiful wife and conventional mother. Permission to spend her fortune not on security, but on spectacle. Permission to become the work of art she had been born to create. The changes began gradually, then accelerated into obsession. Luisa started commissioning gowns from Paul Poiret, the avant-garde designer revolutionizing fashion, with his rejection of corsets and embrace of exotic Orientalism. She appeared at the opera in a dress of gold lamb that caught light like liquid metal, her eyes outlined in kohl like an Egyptian queen. She wore live snakes as jewelry, their scales cool against her skin, their presence transforming her from woman into myth. She began collecting exotic animals, cheetahs, which she walked through Venice's streets on diamond-studded leashes, albino peacocks that screamed in her palazzos gardens, enormous wolfhounds that accompanied her everywhere. The animals were not pets but props in the ongoing performance of her life, visual declarations that she existed outside conventional boundaries. Her spending became legendary. She commissioned portraits from every significant artist in Europe, Giovanni Boldini, Augustus John, Kees van Dongen, not because she needed their validation, but because she understood that art was how one achieved immortality. Each portrait captured a different version of herself, the sorceress, the empress, the demon, the goddess. She was creating a mythology, using paint and canvas to write herself into history. Camillo watched his wife's transformation with growing alarm. The fortune he had married was disappearing into costumes and parties, into art collections and architectural follies. He attempted to reason with her, to remind her of their daughter, of their responsibilities, of proper behavior expected from a woman of her position. "I am creating something that will outlive all of us," Luisa told him, her voice cold with certainty. "Your name will be remembered, because I carried it. Your daughter will inherit a legend, not just money. You should be grateful." But he was not grateful. He was frightened, recognizing that he had married a woman now beyond his control, beyond anyone's control. She had discovered that money could buy freedom from every convention, every expectation, every limitation society imposed on women, and she intended to spend every last lira proving it. In spring 1910, Luisa made her decision final. She would leave the pretense of conventional marriage behind. She would establish herself in Venice, in the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, an unfinished 18th-century palazzo she would transform into a temple of aesthetic excess. She would host salons that would scandalize and captivate Europe's artistic elite. She would become the living embodiment of decadence, beauty, and rebellion. Camillo stood in their bedroom, watching his wife pack trunks filled with costumes and jewels. "You are destroying yourself," he said quietly. "This obsession will consume you." Luisa turned to face him, and her smile was both beautiful and terrible. "Then I will burn brilliantly. Better to be consumed by one's own vision than to slowly suffocate in someone else's idea of propriety. I am going to become immortal, Camillo. What will you become?" He had no answer. There was no answer. She was already gone, already transformed into something he could not follow, could not understand, could not stop. Chapter 3. The Major Setback or Crisis. 15 August 1912, Thursday, Venice, Italy. Luisa establishes herself in Venice's Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, transforming it into a legendary center of avant-garde culture and scandalous excess. She hosts elaborate parties that blur the line between art and madness, spending millions on theatrical spectacles that shock and mesmerize Europe's elite. Her affairs with artists and intellectuals become public knowledge, but she embraces scandal as proof of her transcendence. However, Her relationship with daughter Christina deteriorates as the girl grows up neglected and confused by her mother's increasingly bizarre behavior. The chapter reaches its crisis point during Luisa's most ambitious spectacle, a midnight procession through Venice featuring herself as a living goddess, accompanied by her exotic menagerie. The carefully orchestrated event descends into chaos when one of her cheetahs, startled by crowds and flashbulbs, attacks a German tourist, severely injuring him. The scandal threatens her position in society for the first time, as newspapers report not on her artistic vision, but on her dangerous recklessness. The incident marks a turning point where European society begins to view her not as fascinating but as genuinely dangerous and mentally unstable. She realizes that her quest for immortality is beginning to exact a terrible price, and that her fortune, vast as it is, might not be enough to pay it. The palazzo was perfect precisely because it was incomplete. Built in 1749, construction had halted after only the ground floor was finished, leaving it forever unfinished, forever reaching toward a grandeur it would never achieve. Luisa understood that incompleteness could be its own form of perfection, that the unfinished contained more possibility than anything complete and static. She spent 2 million lire transforming the palazzo into her vision of paradise. The entrance hall was painted entirely in black lacquer, with gold leaf details that caught candlelight and transformed darkness into something precious. She installed fountains that ran with champagne during parties. She filled rooms with exotic plants, orchids from Southeast Asia, carnivorous flowers from the Amazon, roses bred to bloom black. The gardens became a jungle where peacocks screamed and cheetahs prowled, where guests never knew if they were in Venice or some fever dream of colonial exoticism. Her bedroom was a masterpiece of theatrical excess. The walls were draped in crimson velvet. The bed was elevated on a dais and surrounded by mirrors, so she could watch herself from every angle, studying her own beauty as if it were a scientific experiment. She slept on silk sheets costing more than a gondolier earned in a year, and often did not sleep at all, preferring to wander the palazzo at night dressed in costumes that transformed her into different characters: a Byzantine empress, a Renaissance courtesan, a pagan priestess. The parties she hosted became legendary throughout Europe. Invitations to Palazzo Venier de Leoni were coveted by artists, writers, and aristocrats who understood that attending one of Luisa's soirees meant witnessing something existing outside normal reality. She did not merely entertain guests, she staged experiences that blurred the boundary between life and art. For one party, she had the entire palazzo illuminated by thousands of candles, their flames reflected in strategically placed mirrors until the building seemed to burn with cold fire. She descended the staircase wearing a gown of gold tissue and a headdress of peacock feathers that added 2 feet to her height, accompanied by her cheetahs on leashes of diamonds and platinum. Musicians played compositions commissioned specifically for the evening, their atonal melodies designed to unsettle and provoke. Guests were served absinthe in crystal glasses while acrobats performed overhead, their bodies painted gold, their movements suggesting rituals from religions that had never existed. The cost of that single evening exceeded 100,000 lire, but Luisa considered it an investment in immortality. She knew everyone present would remember the night for the rest of their lives, would tell stories about the Marchesa Casati and her impossible palazzo, would ensure her name became synonymous with a kind of beauty that transcended mere wealth. But beauty, she was discovering, required constant escalation. Each party had to surpass the previous one. Each public appearance demanded more audacity, more shock, more spectacle. She began appearing in St. Mark's Square at midnight, dressed in gowns of her own design, dresses made entirely of peacock feathers, or transparent fabrics that revealed her body like a classical statue, or costumes that transformed her into mythological creatures. She would stand in the center of the piazza, perfectly still, while tourists and Venetians gathered to stare, to photograph, to gossip. The press called her the Medusa of Venice, and she embraced the comparison. Medusa, after all, was a woman whose beauty was so terrible it turned men to stone, a woman whose power came from being looked at, from commanding attention through sheer visual force. Luisa understood she was creating herself as a kind of monster, but monsters were remembered when ordinary women were forgotten. Her affairs became as theatrical as her parties. She took lovers from the artistic elite, painters who immortalized her in portraits, poets who wrote sonnets to her beauty, sculptors who captured her form in marble. Each affair was public, scandalous, designed to generate gossip that would spread her legend further. She was not interested in love. Love was bourgeois, conventional, limiting. She wanted passion that could be transformed into art, relationships that would become stories, encounters that would echo through history. But there was one relationship she could not transform into legend, one connection that remained stubbornly, painfully real: her daughter. Christina was 11 years old in 1912, old enough to understand that her mother was not like other mothers, old enough to feel the absence of maternal affection as a wound that never healed. The girl lived in the palazzo, but might as well have lived on another continent. Luisa barely acknowledged her presence, viewing the child as a reminder of her former life, of the conventional role she had rejected. On rare occasions when they encountered each other in the palazzo's corridors, Christina would study her mother, with a mixture of awe and confusion. This woman dressed in costumes, surrounded by exotic animals, hosting parties that lasted until dawn. Was this really her mother? Or was she some imposter who had replaced the person who was supposed to love her? "Why don't you spend time with me?" Christina asked once, her voice small but determined. "Why am I always with the governesses?" Luisa looked at her daughter as if seeing her for the first time. The girl was pretty in a conventional way, with dark hair and serious eyes that seemed to judge everything they observed. She looked nothing like Luisa, nothing like the creature of myth and scandal Luisa was becoming. "Because I am creating something more important than family," Luisa said, her voice not unkind, but utterly certain. "I am making myself immortal. One day you will understand. One day you will be grateful that your mother was more than just a mother." But Christina did not understand, and as the years passed, the distance between them would only grow wider, until it became an abyss that no amount of money or art could bridge. The crisis came on the night of August 15, 1912, during what was supposed to be Luisa's most spectacular party yet. She had planned a midnight procession through Venice, with herself as the centerpiece, a living goddess carried through the streets on a sedan chair, accompanied by musicians, dancers, and her menagerie of exotic animals. The procession would wind through the city, gathering spectators, creating a spectacle that would be photographed and discussed across Europe. Everything began perfectly. Luisa was dressed in a gown of white silk that seemed to glow in the moonlight, her eyes outlined in kohl, her hair decorated with diamonds that caught the light of hundreds of torches. She sat on her chair like a pagan deity while her servants carried her through the narrow streets, her cheetahs walking alongside, their leashes held by attendants dressed as Egyptian slaves. Crowds gathered to watch, tourists and Venetians alike mesmerized by the impossible sight. Photographers captured the moment, their flashbulbs exploding like small suns. Everything was exactly as Luisa had envisioned: art made flesh, myth made real. Then, one of the cheetahs, startled by the crowd and the noise, lunged at a spectator. The animal's teeth sank into the arm of a German tourist, a wealthy industrialist who had come to Venice specifically to see the famous Marchesa Casati. Blood spread across his white shirt while the crowd screamed. Luisa's servants struggled to control the animal, while others rushed to help the injured man. The perfect spectacle dissolved into chaos, beauty transforming into violence in an instant. Luisa sat frozen on her chair, watching her carefully constructed mythology collapse around her. The man would survive, But the scandal would not. The newspapers would report not on her artistic vision, but on her recklessness, her dangerous obsessions, her failure to control the very spectacle she had created. As servants carried her back to the palazzo through streets now empty of admirers, Luisa understood for the first time that her quest for immortality might destroy her before she achieved it. The price of legend was higher than she had calculated, and she was beginning to suspect that her fortune, vast as it was, might not be enough to pay it. The morning newspapers were brutal. Marchesa's beast attacks innocent tourist screamed one headline. The madness of Luisa Casati declared another. For the first time, the coverage was not admiring but condemning. She was no longer a fascinating eccentric, but a dangerous madwoman whose reckless pursuit of spectacle endangered innocent people. Standing in her palazzo's morning room, surrounded by the debris of the previous night's shattered dream, Luisa realized she had crossed a line from which there might be no return. The world was beginning to turn against her, and all her billions might not be enough to buy her way back into its good graces. Chapter 4. The Unraveling. 3 November 1925, Tuesday, Paris, France. The scandal of the cheetah attack marks the beginning of Luisa's decline. European society, once fascinated by her eccentricity, begins viewing her as dangerous and mentally unstable. Her spending accelerates desperately as she attempts to maintain her legendary status, but her fortune proves finite and her artistic vision increasingly divorced from reality. She loses the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, forced to move between increasingly modest accommodations while still attempting to maintain her theatrical lifestyle. Her relationship with Cristina reaches its breaking point when the now teenage girl confronts her mother about years of neglect, choosing to live with her father permanently. World War I devastates what remains of Luisa's wealth as markets collapse and properties become worthless. She watches helplessly as the world she knew, aristocratic excess and artistic decadence, collapses around her. The war ends not just a historical era but her personal golden age. By the mid-1920s, she is forced to sell her art collection, including the portraits that were supposed to ensure her immortality, piece by piece to pay debts. The chapter ends with Luisa alone in a rented Parisian apartment, surrounded by a few remaining costumes, finally understanding that she has sacrificed everything real for the pursuit of something that was always an illusion. The war had changed everything, though Luisa refused to acknowledge it. While young men died in trenches and empires collapsed, she continued her performance as if the world were still the playground of the wealthy and eccentric. But the audience was disappearing, and even she could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. She had lost the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni in 1913, forced to sell it when her debts exceeded even her considerable fortune. The palazzo that had been her temple, her stage, her masterpiece, gone to pay for parties that existed now only in photographs and fading memories. She told herself it didn't matter, that she could create new stages, new spectacles, that her legend transcended any single location. But it did matter. Without the palazzo, she was just a woman in expensive costumes, no longer a goddess in her own temple. She moved to Paris, renting a series of apartments that grew progressively smaller as her money dwindled. She still commissioned gowns from Poiret, still appeared at galleries and salons, still walked the streets with her remaining cheetah and wolfhounds. But the gasps of admiration were fewer now, replaced by whispers of concern, by suggestions that perhaps the Marchesa had gone too far, that her eccentricity had crossed the line into madness. Her financial situation was catastrophic, though she refused to examine it too closely. She had spent approximately 60 million lire, billions in modern currency, on her transformation into legend. The money had purchased costumes, parties, art, animals, properties, and the services of countless artists and servants. But money, she was discovering, was not infinite, even when one began with a fortune that seemed limitless. Her business manager, Giuseppe, who had served her family for decades, attempted to explain the reality of her situation. "Marchesa, you must understand. The war has destroyed the value of your remaining Italian investments. Your properties generate no income because you refuse to rent them. Your spending continues at an unsustainable rate. If you do not change your habits, you will be bankrupt within 5 years." Luisa looked at him with eyes that had lost none of their intensity, even as everything else began to crumble. "Then I will be a bankrupt legend. Better that than a wealthy nobody. Continue paying my accounts." But even her willpower could not create money that no longer existed. Her creditors became more insistent. Shops that had once competed for her patronage now refused to extend further credit. She began selling her art collection, the portraits that were supposed to ensure her immortality, sold piece by piece to pay for rent and food and the maintenance of an image that fewer people cared about with each passing year. The worst moment came when she was forced to sell her animals. The cheetahs, the peacocks, the wolfhounds, all the creatures that had been part of her mythology, part of her transformation from woman into legend. She told herself they were just props, just elements of her performance. But when the last cheetah was taken away, she wept for the first time in years. Her daughter found her that evening, sitting alone in a nearly empty apartment, surrounded by trunks of costumes that no longer had anywhere to go. Cristina was 18 now, a young woman who had grown up in the shadow of her mother's obsession, who had learned to expect nothing and therefore could not be disappointed. "I'm getting married," Cristina said, her voice flat, emotionless, "to an English lord. Father arranged it. I came to tell you, though I don't know why. You've never cared about my life." Luisa looked up at her daughter, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. Cristina was beautiful in a conventional way, elegant and composed, everything that Luisa had rejected. But there was something missing in her eyes, a warmth, a connection, a sense of having been loved. Luisa had given her daughter wealth and a famous name, but she had withheld the only thing that actually mattered. "I was trying to become immortal," Luisa said softly. "I was trying to create something that would outlast death. I thought that was more important than being your mother." "And did you succeed?" Cristina asked, and the question was not curious, but cruel. "Are you immortal now, Mother? Or are you just alone?" The girl left without waiting for an answer, and Luisa sat in the darkness of her rented apartment, finally understanding what she had sacrificed. She had spent billions to become a legend, but legends were cold comfort when one was alone and aging and running out of money. She had transformed herself into a work of art, but art could not love her back, could not forgive her, could not fill the emptiness that had driven her from the beginning. The war ended, and the world that emerged was one that had no place for marchesas who walked cheetahs through city streets. The 1920s brought a new kind of excess, a democratic decadence that did not require billions or aristocratic titles. Luisa's type of spectacle, expensive, elitist, rooted in pre-war notions of aristocratic privilege, seemed suddenly quaint, a relic of a world that no longer existed. She continued to dress in her costumes, continued to apply her dramatic makeup, continued to perform the role she had created, but the audiences were gone. The photographers stopped following her. The newspapers stopped writing about her. She had achieved her goal of becoming unforgettable, but she was learning that being remembered and being relevant were two entirely different things. By 1925, she was living in a 2-room apartment in Paris, most of her possessions sold, her fortune reduced to a small pension that barely covered rent and food. She still owned a few costumes, a few pieces of jewelry, a few photographs of her glory days. She would put on her makeup and her gowns and walk through the streets of Paris, an aging woman dressed like an Egyptian queen, ignored by passers-by who had their own concerns, their own lives, their own definitions of what mattered. One evening, she stood before a mirror, not the elaborate mirrors of her palazzo, but a simple glass in a rented room, and studied her reflection. The face that looked back was still beautiful in its way, but it was the beauty of a mask, of a performance that had gone on too long. Beneath the coal and the powder was a woman who had spent everything to become a legend, and was only now discovering that legends were just stories people told, and stories could be forgotten as easily as they were remembered. She thought of her daughter, married now and living in England, a woman who had learned to build a life without a mother's love. She thought of her husband who had died during the war, taking with him any possibility of reconciliation. She thought of all the artists who had painted her, the poets who had praised her, the society figures who had gasped at her spectacles. Where were they now? Had her legend touched their lives in any meaningful way? Or had she been merely entertainment, a curiosity, a scandal to discuss over dinner? The question she had asked herself on her wedding night returned with terrible clarity. What if money could buy immortality? She had spent her life answering that question, and the answer was devastating in its simplicity. Money could buy spectacle, excess, beauty, art. It could buy photographs and portraits and newspaper articles. It could buy the attention of the world, at least for a while. But it could not buy meaning. It could not buy love. It could not buy the feeling that one's life had mattered for reasons beyond mere visibility. She had become exactly what she set out to become, a legend, a myth, an unforgettable figure in the history of excess and decadence. But in becoming that legend, she had ceased to be human, and now she was trapped in the role she had created, unable to escape, unable to connect, unable to be anything except the Marchesa Casati, the woman who had spent billions to become a story. Chapter 5. Resolution and Final Reflection. 1st June 1957, Saturday, London, England. In her final years, Louisa lives in poverty in London, supported by a meager pension and occasional charity from old friends who remember her glory days. She continues dressing in theatrical costumes and applying dramatic makeup, performing the role of the legendary Marchesa, even when there is no audience to witness it. Her daughter Christina visits once, a tense encounter revealing the permanent damage caused by Louisa's choices. As World War II rages, Louisa reflects on her life and the price of her quest for immortality. She dies in 1957, nearly forgotten, in a small London flat. But in death, she achieves strange vindication. Her portraits and photographs resurface, inspiring new generations of artists and fashion designers. The chapter concludes with an ambiguous meditation on whether her sacrifice was worth it, whether legend is a form of immortality, and what it means to be remembered when one is no longer alive to experience that remembrance. The final reflection poses the central question of her life. She succeeded in becoming unforgettable, but was the price, her humanity, her relationships, her sanity, too high? History remembers her name, but history cannot tell us whether, in her final moments, she believed the sacrifice was worth it. The flat on Beaufort Street was nothing like the palazzos and villas of her past. 2 small rooms on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled of boiled cabbage and coal smoke. The walls were water-stained. The windows looked out on a narrow street where working-class families went about their ordinary lives. It was the kind of place where Luisa Casati should never have ended up. Yet here she was, 76 years old and living on a pension of £2 per week. She still dressed as if she were attending a ball at the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni. Each morning, she would spend hours applying her makeup, the heavy kohl around her eyes, the white powder on her face, the crimson lipstick that transformed her mouth into a wound. She would put on one of her remaining gowns, now threadbare and stained, but still retaining some echo of their former grandeur. Then she would walk through the streets of Chelsea, an ancient woman dressed like an Egyptian priestess, accompanied by no cheetahs, no servants, no photographers, just her own stubborn refusal to surrender the role she had created. The neighbors thought she was mad. Children followed her sometimes, laughing at the strange old lady in her costume. She ignored them, moving through the streets with the same regal bearing she had once displayed in Venice, as if poverty and age and obscurity were merely temporary inconveniences that would soon be corrected. Her few remaining friends visited occasionally, bringing food and small amounts of money disguised as loans they knew would never be repaid. They spoke to her carefully, as one speaks to someone who has suffered a profound loss but refuses to acknowledge it. They remembered her glory days, the parties, the scandals, the magnificent excess, and they tried not to compare that woman with the one who now lived in a flat barely large enough for one person. "You should write your memoirs," one friend suggested gently. "People would pay to read about your life. You could earn money from your story." But Luisa refused. "My life was meant to be lived, not written. I am a work of art, not a book. Art is experienced, not explained." She clung to that belief even as evidence mounted that her art had failed, that her legend was fading, that the immortality she had purchased with billions was proving as temporary as everything else in life. The visit from Christina came in the spring of 1955. Her daughter was now 53 years old, a respectable English matron with children of her own. She arrived at the flat dressed in sensible clothes, her face carefully composed, prepared for the encounter with the woman who had given birth to her, but had never really been her mother. They sat across from each other in the cramped living room, two women who shared blood but nothing else. Luisa was dressed in one of her costumes, her makeup applied with the same precision as always, performing the role even for an audience of one who had no interest in the performance. "I came because my children asked about their grandmother," Christina said finally. "They see photographs of you in books about the Belle Époque. They ask why we never visit you. I don't know how to explain that their grandmother chose to be a legend instead of a person." Luisa studied her daughter's face, seeing the hurt that had calcified into something harder, colder, permanent. "I gave you a famous name," she said. "I made you the daughter of a legend. Isn't that worth something?" "No," Christina said simply. "It's worth nothing. My children don't care that their grandmother was famous. They just wonder why she never wanted to know them. I spent my childhood waiting for you to notice me, and I spent my adulthood trying to forgive you. I'm done with both." She stood to leave, and Luisa felt a panic she had not experienced in decades. This was her daughter, her only child, the one connection to something real that she had never completely severed. If Christina left now, that connection would be broken forever. "I thought I was creating something important," Luisa said, her voice breaking. "I thought beauty and art and legend were more important than ordinary things like motherhood. I thought I could transcend the limitations that trapped other women." Christina looked at her mother, and her expression was not angry, but sad, the sadness of someone mourning a loss that happened so long ago that even grief had become a memory. "You did transcend those limitations. You became exactly what you wanted to become, but you never understood that those limitations were also connections, that the things you rejected were the only things that actually mattered. You're a legend, Mother. Congratulations. I hope it was worth it." She left, and Luisa sat alone in her flat, finally understanding the full price of her choices. She had spent billions to become immortal. But immortality was just another word for being remembered by people who never knew you, who could never love you, who experienced you only as a story, a curiosity, a cautionary tale. The years passed slowly. World War II came, and London was bombed, but Luisa survived, too stubborn or too cursed to die. She continued her daily walks, continued her makeup rituals, continued to perform the role of the legendary Marchesa, even as the world around her transformed into something she no longer recognized. She lived on charity now, accepting small payments from friends and admirers who remembered her glory days. She sold her last pieces of jewelry, her remaining costumes, anything that could be converted into the money she needed to survive. But she never stopped dressing up, never stopped applying her makeup, never stopped being Luisa Casati, because that was all she had left. The performance, the role, the legend that had consumed her life. On June 1st, 1957, Luisa Casati died in her flat on Beaufort Street. She was 76 years old. The newspapers that had once breathlessly reported her every scandal barely noticed her passing. A few obituaries appeared, brief paragraphs noting that the eccentric Marchesa, who had once been famous for her extravagant parties, had died in poverty in London. Most people who read those obituaries had never heard of her. She was buried in Brompton Cemetery in an unmarked grave. The woman who had spent billions on spectacle and beauty laid to rest without ceremony or monument. Her daughter did not attend the funeral. There were perhaps a dozen mourners, old friends who remembered when she had been magnificent, when her name had meant something, when the world had gasped at her audacity. But death, it turned out, was not the end of the story. In the decades that followed, something strange happened. The photographs and portraits that Luisa had commissioned began to resurface, discovered in attics and archives, displayed in museums and galleries. Fashion designers found inspiration in her dramatic style, her bold use of costume and makeup. Artists studied the portraits painted by Boldini and Van Dongen, recognizing in them something that transcended mere documentation, a vision of beauty as performance, of life as art, of the self as something that could be created and recreated according to one's will. Books were written about her, exhibitions were mounted, fashion shows paid homage to her aesthetic. The legend that had seemed to die with her was resurrected, transformed, given new life by people who had never met her, but who recognized in her story something universal, the desire to transcend ordinary existence, to be remembered, to matter. Was it worth it? The question echoes across the decades, unanswerable because it depends on what one values. Luisa Casati spent her entire fortune, billions in modern currency, to transform herself from a wealthy woman into a legend. She sacrificed her marriage, her relationship with her daughter, her financial security, and ultimately her sanity in pursuit of a kind of immortality that exists only in photographs and stories. She died alone and poor, forgotten by most of the world, mourning the connections she had rejected in favor of spectacle. But she also achieved exactly what she set out to achieve. She became unforgettable, a figure whose name and image continue to inspire and provoke, whose life serves as both warning and inspiration. Perhaps the truth is that both things are true simultaneously. She succeeded and failed. She achieved immortality and lost everything that made life worth living. She became a legend and ceased to be human. The billions she spent bought her a place in history, but could not buy happiness, love, or meaning. In the end, Luisa Casati's life poses a question rather than providing an answer. What is the value of being remembered if you are not alive to experience that remembrance? What does immortality mean when it is purchased at the cost of everything that makes mortality bearable? She spent her fortune trying to escape the limitations of ordinary existence, and she succeeded. But the escape was also a kind of imprisonment, a trap she built for herself with billions of lire and could never escape. The photographs remain, haunting in their beauty and strangeness. The portraits hang in museums, capturing a woman who transformed herself into myth. The story continues to be told, the legend perpetuated by people who never knew her, but who recognize in her something essential about the human desire to transcend, to matter, to be more than just another person who lived and died and was forgotten. Whether that is enough, whether legend is an adequate substitute for love, whether being remembered is worth the price of being alone, is a question each person must answer for themselves. Luisa Casati made her choice, spent her billions, and became exactly what she wanted to become. History remembers her name. But history cannot tell us whether, in her final moments in that small London flat, she believed the sacrifice was worth it.